the statecraft is really something that needs to be practiced by the state leaders. So how to craft the state policy. So that's all statecraft is about. We see more and more competition in this region, basically the geography of the former Soviet Union. So if your sovereignty is eroded, if you don't have full free hand in managing your economic affairs and also managing your diplomacy, it's extremely difficult for you to convert wealth to power or to use your diplomatic tools to achieve economic prosperity. When I say wealth-power relationship, which is essential for defining economic statecraft, I also include the survival of the regime. So in other words, when a country mobilizes its economic strength or uses diplomacy, one of the fundamental purposes is to ensure independence, ensure the political survival, the survival of the political regime. Hello, everyone. My name is Xiaotong Zhang, professor from the Department of International Relations and Regional Studies, KMAP University. I'm also the academic director for China and Central Asia Studies Center. Today it's my great honor to present my newly published book on New Economic Statecraft, China, the United States, and the European Union. And also today, I'm very happy to see, first of all, my colleagues from the Department of Economics. We have the chair of Department of Economics, and Professor Nadim from Department of Economics, and also Professor Vladimir from my department, Department of International Relations. And also equally happily, I see my students who attend the class Domestic Politics and Foreign Policy of the People's Republic of China. And also some students from my master program class, like SL. You're very much welcome. And also I appreciate my center's coordinator, Mariam, for making all this happen. And today's book launch is an important event for our center, China and Central Asia Studies Center. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to start my presentation. Oh, I also see my colleague guys out over there. Thank you, welcoming. And I'm going to talk about 30, 35 minutes maximum. Then we would have plenty of time for questions and answers. Just a second. Okay. So basically today I'm going to talk about what is economic statecraft and why my book is titled New Economic Statecraft. And since we are here in Kazakhstan, we are going to talk about Kazakhstan's economic statecraft. You know, that's going to be something very new. And then I will talk about the economic statecraft practiced by the major great powers such as China, the United States, and also the European Union as a major industrialized economy. And then finally, why now, not 10 years ago, why now study economic statecraft? And finally, I would emphasize that we have now two geographical pivots of new economic statecraft. One is Indo-Pacific, the other is Eurasia region. It's working. So first, what is economic statecraft? I first encountered economic statecraft when I served as deputy director of US desk of the Chinese government. One morning, I just saw a briefing from my colleague from Washington, D.C., from the Chinese embassy in Washington, D.C., talking about Hillary Clinton's speech, economic statecraft, when she gave that speech in the Economic Club of New York in 2011. So basically, she gave a policy speech which systematically defined what is economic statecraft according to American State Department, and also how the United States is going to practice economic statecraft. So for the then Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, economic statecraft has two parts. First part, how the United States harnesses the forces and use the tools of global economics to strengthen American diplomacy and presence abroad. So this is the first part. And the second part, how the United States puts that diplomacy and presence to work to strengthen American economy at home. So it is a two-way street, right? How America use her diplomacy to strengthen her economy. And the second part, how the United States use its economic leverage to strengthen America's global profile, to ensure American economic primacy and also political leadership. So for me, it's a new concept. So after that, after 2012, I moved to academia, and I started to spend a lot of time researching on the concept economic statecraft. I even created a center about economic diplomacy in Wuhan University in China. Not working. All right. So why my book is titled New Economic Statecraft? So you can see on the left, there is a book called Economic Statecraft, authored by Professor David Baldwin, published in 1985. So more than 30 years ago, nearly 40 years ago, Professor David Baldwin single-handedly wrote a book systematically theorizing economic statecraft, and also throughout historical lens, and also focused very much on the techniques of economic statecraft. He was a great inspiration for me. And after 40 years, I am very lucky and I'm very privileged to author my own book called New Economic Statecraft. To a large extent, my book is a continuation, but also a critique of Professor David Baldwin's economic statecraft. So this is why I call this New Economic Statecraft. And also during my sabbatical in the United States, I also met with Professor David Baldwin at Princeton University. I also salute him for his very seminal work on this concept. And nowadays, economic statecraft has become very popular concept, mainly in the United States. But 40 years ago, when Professor David Baldwin published his book, the United States mainly used the idea economic diplomacy, as it is practiced in most countries like in Japan, India, China, to a less extent, European Union. But nowadays, so after Hillary Clinton gave that policy speech, America, especially their State Department, used more and more economic statecraft instead of economic diplomacy. And we see a growing trend that economic statecraft as a concept, as a research subject, and also as a policy practice has been used more and more in the European Union and also in China and probably in other parts of the world. So what is my definition of economic statecraft? Economic statecraft is the practical, economic statecraft as a research subject is the practical study of how a country can grow its economy and leverage its economic strengths to become a strong nation and maintain that status in international politics. So this is basically all our research is all about, right? So we need to focus on how to grow a country's economy as the first step. Then the second step is how that economic strength can be converted to power, to the status of a strong nation in international politics. So in other words, economic statecraft as a research subject or as a discipline is really standing at the crossroads of international economics, diplomacy, and international politics. So international political economy is probably the closest discipline towards economic statecraft. And I define economic statecraft as a concept. I define economic statecraft as the skill, the art, the strategy, and the process of a wealth generation, wealth extraction, wealth mobilization, and a two-way conversion between wealth and power by a state's central government for the purpose of acquiring and maintaining great power status. So if you read my book, you can find all this information on page 17. So you can see, for us as our Department of International Relations, we really focus on the skill, the strategy, and also the process of how you convert your economic strengths into your power. But more than that, not just conversion, but also how you can, a country can manage its economy, grow its economy, increase wealth, national wealth. And the implementation of economic statecraft is essentially a nation state's strategic management of wealth and power. So it is strategic management of wealth and power, with a view to a dynamic equilibrium between wealth and power, between the two. So often an empire easily exhausts itself by waging religious wars or all kind of territorial wars, and finding it overburdened, overstretched itself, and finding that empire collapsed. So if you study Paul Kennedy's book, The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, you can see for an empire or for a hegemon to sustain, it's extremely important to manage the interrelationships between wealth and power. And the most important lesson is to avoid overstretch. So if you want to wage a war, be careful. And even after the war is waged, it's extremely important to manage the warfare, the wartime economics, to avoid long-term overextension, overstretch. Okay? So the mobilization of the national wealth is extremely important. Okay, so some specific case studies. First about Kazakhstan. So Kazakhstan is a very interesting case study. I learned a lot from my students, also from my conversation with my colleagues, and also for reading the paper from my colleague. So I find that economic statecraft is not just the baby of great powers. It's not just the luxury that could only be enjoyed by great powers. Economic statecraft could also be a tool, a policy tool, to be used by middle power or even by small and medium-sized powers. And Kazakhstan is a case in point. So the middle corridor is Kazakhstan's way of using geography to grow its economy and leverage its economic strengths to become a strong state and maintain that status in international politics. And also the Eurasia Economic Union, which was proposed by the previous president of Kazakhstan, Nazarbayev, was also an example of Kazakhstan's economic statecraft, right? So through establishing economic union, through economic integration, Kazakhstan can benefit from Eurasia Economic Union and also maintain its status, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So economic integration is one way of economic statecraft. And the middle corridor, the so-called geo-economics, could also be another way of economic statecraft. So basically using your geographical position to benefit, and then use that pivotal position to grow your economy, to strengthen your economic interconnection with other parts of the Eurasian continent. And finally, with the aim of building a strong nation. So that's the case of Kazakhstan. So let's, oh. I'm going to talk about, maybe next slide, about the economic statecraft of China, the United States, and the European Union. Okay, so before that, I'm going to talk about why now study economic statecraft. As I said, before 2008, before the global financial crisis, for example, in the United States, people mainly use the term economic diplomacy. Very few people talked about economic statecraft. So economic statecraft became a buzzword only after Hillary Clinton gave that policy speech. And it has become more so after Donald Trump came into office. I mean, in the context of the United States practice economic statecraft. And nowadays, after Russia-Ukrainian war in 2022, economic sanctions are largely perceived as a way of practicing negative economic statecraft. So there are two forms of economic statecraft. So one is a positive, for example, like Middle Corridor, for example, like Euro-Asia Economic Union, or free trade agreements, or establishing economic integration is the positive form of economic statecraft. But you have the negative side of economic statecraft, which is economic sanctions, and how to counter economic sanctions. They are also part of the research of economic statecraft. So if you look at what happened since 9/11, we had financial crisis, we had Spring of Arab, Brexit, popular president of the United States, Donald Trump 1.0, then we probably will have Donald Trump 2.0. And also US-China trade war in 2018, Russia-Ukrainian war in 2022, and Israel-Hamas war in 2023. So what we are witnessing is the dramatic changes unseen in a century, right? The similar scenario is probably the eve of 1914, the eve of the First World War. That was dramatic. That was unprecedented within 100 years. And don't forget the pandemic. So we are witnessing multiple crises, permanent crises, one crisis after the other. So that is why before the Great War comes to us again, more and more powers started to study how to use economic strengths for the purpose of power, for the purpose of politics. So that is the external context of economic statecraft. That's why I call my book New Economic Statecraft. So basically the situation, the context we are witnessing today is very much different from 1990s and 2000s, especially the first 10 years of 2000s. So we are in a very uncertain era. We're in a very difficult era. Okay, perfect. Economic statecraft, China, United States, and European Union. So today, when people talk about China's economic statecraft, people talk a lot about Belt and Road Initiative. But I also want to remind you that China's new economic statecraft after President Xi Jinping came into office was much more than Belt and Road Initiative. So actually the new leadership in China since 2012, they started a fascinating liberalization campaign. When I say liberalization campaign, I mean China was very much inspired by economic liberalism in the format of launching trade negotiations, including regional comprehensive economic partnership, which was finally approved 2 years ago. And also China started to negotiate it at the same time with the United States and also with the European Union about bilateral investment treaties. So when we talk about bilateral investment treaties, it is not just about investment protection. It is much more than conventional bilateral investment treaty. So for US-China BIT, bilateral investment treaty, It includes two essential provisions. One is pre-establishment national treatment, and the second is negative list. So in other words, out of the BIT negotiations, China and the United States are committed to basically liberalizing all the investment sectors, except the negative list. So except a very small, a short list of sectors which are not open to external investments. But unfortunately, the US-China BIT negotiation failed after Trump came into office. And the EU-China Bilateral Investment Treaty now has stalled, even though the negotiation has completed. But because of the Uyghur issue, the autonomous region in China, because of the EU imposed global human rights sanctions against China in March 2021, and China immediately retaliated. So, and China imposed sanctions on two key institutions. One is the Political and Security Committee of the Council of the European Union, and the other is the Trade Committee of the European Parliament. And European Council, Council of the European Union and the European Parliament are the two institutions that approve, that ratify the EU-China BIT. So since China imposed sanctions on these two institutions, so the EU-China BIT ratification process got stalled. Okay. And also China established in Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. So basically for China's new economic statecraft has two prongs. The first is trade and investment liberalization, represented by ICEP and US-China BIT, EU-China BIT. And the other is BRI. So it is huge investments, huge interconnections around infrastructure. So these are two prongs. So even today, China is still practicing, to some extent, economic liberalism. And China is committed to join the CPTPP. China is negotiating the Digital Trade Economic Partnership Agreement, DEPA, DEPA. And I think that in China, there are a lot of cities, a lot of interest groups who are very committed to economic liberalism, because without opening up, without further reforming, China's economy can no longer grow in a sustainable way. So that is China's new economic statecraft. For the US economic statecraft, it was really something. And I would like to say there was continuation and disruption between President Trump and President Biden. So the United States also tried trade liberalization during Obama time, starting TPP and the TTIP, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership Agreement, TTIP, and also TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. But both failed thanks to Donald Trump came into office. He just said the United States just left the table, okay? And Donald Trump launched the US-China trade war, which was the negative side, economic statecraft, right? So China tried to approach the United States for a positive economic statecraft by promising a very big, fatty contract, so worthy at $250 billion in 2017 when President Donald Trump came to Beijing. So China committed to buying 300 Boeing airplanes, buying $10 billion worth of chips, $10 billion worth of fruits, vegetables, all kind of agricultural products, soybeans, for example, and also committed to invest about $80 billion in the energy sector. But then Donald Trump turned over the table. He started the trade war since March 2018. So positive economic statecraft failed, and then came in negative side economic statecraft, which was trade war and economic sanctions, of course. And Donald Trump started the Indo-Pacific strategy, and President Biden continued with Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is now a very important policy tool for U.S. Department of Commerce. So the United States is managing IPEF. So it's a positive way of economic statecraft by negotiating with IPEF countries like India, like some Southeast Asian countries, and Japan, for example, supply chain cooperation, and also on critical minerals and other parts of economics. And also President Biden came up with the idea of Build Back Better the World. So the B3W initiative, together with the G7 members, it is perceived as an alternative to China-initiated BRI. So the US version of B3W is a value-based alternative to BRI, which is being implemented through the vehicle of PGI, partnership of global infrastructure investment. And for the EU, so when China came up with the idea of BRI, at the very beginning, the Juncker Commission of the European Union welcomed China's idea and worked together with China on the EU-China connectivity platform, which was launched in 2014, 2015. So this is positive side of economic statecraft, okay? Because the EU also invests a lot of money into this platform. But then, after the new president of the European Commission came to office, Madame von der Leyen, she came up with an alternative, which again, value-based democratic alternative to BRI, something called the Global Gateway. So we are witnessing between and among the three major powers, China, USA, and the EU, there are competing economic statecraft. Okay. So when I say power, I mainly mean economic great power. So that's why my book is focused on China, USA, and the EU. And we should not forget Russia, which is a military great power and also a very important economic power. Especially when I come to this place, I realize how important Russia is. Sorry. And these are, sorry. So these are the four historical paradigms of economic statecraft. First is mercantilism, second is liberalism, third is imperialism, and finally is Marxism. So basically, I'm guessing wildly. So if President Trump, if Donald Trump comes to office again, the United States is probably would practicing a new type of mercantilism. So basically, it is America first. Economic, basically, it's kind of economic nationalism. So this is mercantilism, which was a very popular economic statecraft paradigm. Popular for 300 years, since 15th century, all the way to the 18th century. So even British Empire, French Empire, Habsburg dynasty, they all practiced economic, mercantilist economic statecraft. Liberalism, so it was become an idea when Adam Smith published his Wealth of Nations in 1776. But the British Empire did not practice liberalism until the middle of the 19th century, when British Empire finally revoked the Navigation Act and the Corn Law. But economic liberalism was largely a luxury economic statecraft. It cannot be really practiced for a long time. I would argue that only a benign hegemon, especially in the peak time of benign hegemon, is in power. That hegemon can practice economic liberalism, like British Empire, like the United States immediately after the Second World War. And arguably, China is practicing economic liberalism, represented by those trade liberalization campaigns. So I'll be very curious to see whether China will become a new liberal hegemon, I mean, in the future. And whether China will continue to practice economic liberalism started from Deng Xiaoping would be a litmus test for China, whether China could become a benign hegemon in the future. But there's also arguments that China is shifting away from economic liberalism. China is practicing something more self-reliance, more in the sense of autarky, basically self-independence. So sometimes the dual circulation is perceived by the external world as China's return to economic nationalism, which I don't agree, because China is still committed to negotiating deeper CPTPP. And when I travel, when I give consultancy opinion to some Chinese local cities, multinational corporations, I see strong dynamic vitality of a force who are very much committed to economic liberalism. And imperialism, it is in the peak time of the 19th century, and also Marxism. So the USSR practiced Marxist economic statecraft, and Mao Zedong, since 1949 until 1976, practiced Marxist economic statecraft. And don't forget, China is, political regime is a Marxist regime. So you can see there are a lot of elements of Marxist economic statecraft, of Marxism in today China's economic statecraft, like establishing international alliance, very much focused on internationalism, and also China often put moral values before economic benefits, something President Xi Jinping called the correct virtue benefit outlook. So that concept is sometimes difficult to understand. So it has been inspired by Confucius values, because China is a traditional agricultural society. So economic benefits or merchants are not the most important thing, secondary. Okay? And morals, values, especially Confucius ethics, are the most important. And also, the Xi Jinping's moral benefit outlook is also inspired by his Marxist ideology. Okay, so that's very much focused on international assistance. So economic benefits sometimes could be secondary to the moral values. Okay, so inspired by both Confucianism and his Marxist ideology. So these four are the major wealth power paradigms of economic statecraft, which has been practiced by various powers, by various dynasties since 15th century until today. And if you study today's economic statecraft, you can still see some elements of all these four isms. So there's nothing new under the sun, right? The United States probably is practicing again mercantilism. China is practicing a combination of mercantilism, liberalism, and Marxism. I'll come back to that, after the presentation. Realism is very close to mercantilism. So sometimes mercantilism to IPE study is called realism, right? Okay, so the last two slides is about the new geographical pivots of today's economic statecraft. So geographically, the two most important regions for the practice of new economic statecraft are firstly, Indo-Pacific region, and secondly, here, Central Asia and the whole Eurasia region. Why so? So 10 years ago, the global focus of economic statecraft is Asia-Pacific. So between China and the United States, across the Pacific, including the coastal lands of Asia-Pacific region. But today, there's a shift from Asia-Pacific more and more towards Indo-Pacific. Why? Because India is playing a more and more important role because Donald Trump practiced Indo-Pacific strategy. So this is a new area, a new battlefield of geo-economic competition between various powers, including China, United States, Russia, India, and the European Union. So European Union also come up with its own version of the Indo-Pacific strategy. And also France, also Netherlands, they believe that they are Indo-Pacific countries. So they also come up with their version of Indo-Pacific strategies. And another very important geographic pivot in economic statecraft is Eurasia. So basically, we are seeing, so Sir Alfred Mackinder's heartland theory, is come back to life, right? So people are competing around this heartland. And we are seeing the Indo-Pacific strategy here serving as a new crescent island chain encircling China and Russia, right? And we are seeing there's geographic confrontation after Russia-Ukrainian war. And so basically, Central Asia has become a new geographical pivot for new types of economic statecraft. For example, both China, United States, European Union, and Russia are experimenting and practicing all kinds of connectivity projects, right? So B3W has its presence here in Central Asia. Both China and the United States and European Union support the Middle Corridor, which is building an east-west connection of railways, infrastructure, and also trying to cut across the Caspian Sea to the Black Sea and finally to European Union market. So it's east-west. But Russia focus not only east-west, but also north-south connection, right? Linking the whole step of Eurasia all the way cut through Afghanistan, Pakistan, India into the Indian Ocean. And China is practicing BRI in Central Asia and also in the whole Eurasian continent. So conventionally, the classic geopolitics is he who controls heartland controls the world island, which is basically the Eurasian continent plus Africa. So he who controls heartland controls world island, and he who controls world island controls the whole world. So this is the classic geopolitics, which is subject to tremendous criticism. And I myself critique a lot these kind of classic geopolitics theories. I believe there needs to be a new type of geopolitics, which is very much critical of the traditional understanding of geopolitics, which is very much focused on power play, focused on zero-sum game, focused on either or scenarios. I do believe that there is a common denominator in Eurasia, especially in Central Asia. I hope there's going to be some dramatic thing happening. So more and more collaboration of connectivity, something I call maximal connectivity instead of competitive connectivity. So with that, I stop. So here's the manual for practicing new economic statecraft. You are a policymaker. I suggest you follow this manual of practicing economic statecraft. So there are 3 stages of economic statecraft. So wealth production, wealth extraction, and finally, wealth power conversion. And extremely important for any great power to practice economic statecraft is the strategic management to avoid overstretch. So I stop here and the floor is open. I very much welcome to comments and questions. Oh, don't forget, today we have an audience of online participation through Zoom. So first we give floor to the in-person audience. Let's go ahead, as is that. Yeah, please introduce yourself. You need to press the button. Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me now? So I'm Routledge. I'm also a professor at the International Relations Department. So my question here is regarding when you map the Eurasia. So what is the mapping? Are you including Northeast Asia as a part of Eurasia, or the Eurasia is the Eurasian continent? Because still there are some literature that when we say like Eurasia, most tended to put it under the map of the post-Soviet countries, try to exclude some Northern Asian countries or the Southern East Asian countries. So I wonder how you map Eurasia in particular this lecture.
Yes. Thank you. When I mention Eurasia, I mainly refer to basically the size of the USSR. So that does not include Northeast Asia. So it's basically Russia plus Transcaucasus states and Central Asia states. And that also partly includes Afghanistan, Pakistan, and also China. But China is actually outside of this Eurasia. So we see more and more competition in this region, basically the geography of the former Soviet Union. But you are right, Northeast Asia is also becoming a battleground of geoeconomics, if not geopolitics. I see more and more competition there. But for the moment, my understanding of Eurasia does not include Northeast Asia, neither that includes Southeast Asia. So I see, but Southeast Asia belongs to the Indo-Pacific region, right? So Southeast Asia is also a very important part of the geographical pivot of new economic statecraft. Thank you.
Yeah, Nadeem Naqvi, Department of Economics. I have a quick comment and question. With regard to economic or business cost versus benefit, there is a distinction that we sometimes make in normative economics between my psychological ranking of alternatives and my ethical ranking of alternatives. For example, I may like to smoke. So my preference would be to smoke all the time. But my ethical ranking would tell me not to do it when there are others around because it would inflict a cost on them. So President Xi Jinping's moral valuation of outcomes instead of a pure economic valuation is well accommodatable within the domain of moral philosophy, normative economics, as well as in a more encompassing view of the European Enlightenment thinkers, including Immanuel Kant and Amartya Sen. That was a comment. My question is, insofar as new economic statecraft is the process of using skills, art, and other management features to manage the wealth and power configuration of a nation state. Do you not see it as compatible rather than incompatible with John Mearsheimer's theory of offensive realism?
Thank you, Nadeem. I really appreciate your comment about President Xi Jinping's virtue benefit outlook. What your comment makes perfect sense. Sometimes it is very normative, value-based. And in practice, I mean, Chinese companies need to make profit and the BRI projects needs to be sustainable. China often precise as having some debt trap, right? So in other words, all these projects needs to be economically feasible and sustainable. So I think that there's another pragmatic aspect of this moral benefit value. So basically, Professor Xi Jinping also said, if there's a contradiction between economic benefits and morals, let moral go first. But in other cases, we try to see whether there's a compatibility between these two. But you're right, this is a dialectic relationship between morals and values.
Houses are not for speculation. Now that is a moral judgment, but it's a good moral judgment because we have seen the consequences of when houses are treated as speculative instruments. Then we have bust and booms, as they regularly exhibit in the American economy. I'm an American citizen, I know.
Exactly. So you can see that the statecraft is really something that needs to be practiced by the state leaders. So how to craft the state policy. So that's all statecraft is about. And also you asked me a question about John Mearsheimer's offensive realism. I think that relates to realism, right? As you rightly said. So realism is actually something very closely related, genetically related to mercantilism. But mercantilism is basically IPE, international political economy, IPE expression of realism. Whereas realism is more expression of international relation theories. We have realism, liberalism, and constructivism as the three major paradigms or debatable thoughts of IR relation, international relation theories. And for John Mearsheimer's offensive realism, it's really focused about how a nation utilizes its economic strengths and how effectively a nation uses economic strengths to win the war. So in John Mearsheimer's book, The Tragedy of Great Powers, he compared Soviet Union and Nazi Germany in the Second World War. And he explained the reason why finally the Soviet Union could win the war. The Soviet Union could win the war was largely because of Soviet Union is a little bit more efficient in terms of mobilizing national economy, mobilizing financial resources, and converted it into war machines than Nazi Germany. So that means even when Soviet Union, half of the territory was occupied by Nazi Germany, but Soviet Union was still able to produce more tanks, more fighter jets, more bombs than Nazi Germany. So in other words, the Second World War for John Mearsheimer is really a test for who could sustain their war efforts and who laughs best. Thank you.
My name is Aruzhan. I'm a third-year student at IR, and I have a question. How do you think, what role does economic independence play in shaping the effectiveness of economic statecraft? What role does economic independence play in the shaping the effectiveness of economic statecraft?
Yeah, I think that when I say wealth power relationship, which is essential for defining economic statecraft, I also include the survival of the regime. So in other words, when a country mobilizes its economic strengths or uses diplomacy, one of the fundamental purposes is to ensure independence, ensure the political survival, the survival of the political regime. So I would argue that the economic independence would be a precondition of any economic statecraft. So it's easy to understand. So if your sovereignty is eroded, if you don't have full free hand in managing your economic affairs and also managing your diplomacy, it's extremely difficult for you to convert wealth to power or to use your diplomatic tools to achieve economic prosperity. So economic independence is extremely important. So that also largely explains why for Adam Smith. So economic statecraft was actually the idea originally from Adam Smith. So when he wrote The Wealth of Nations, he did mention economic statecraft. He basically say, mercantilists are masters of economic statecraft. So in other words, so economic statecraft, first of all, is an idea practiced by sovereign states. So in other words, economic independence or political independence is the prerequisite for mercantilists to practice economic statecraft. So without independence, no economic statecraft, no great economic statecraft. So for mercantilists, their first and utmost purpose is to ensure independence, to ensure that they become a strong sovereign state. So that is why economic statecraft become a paradigm after the Westphalia system was established. So that all relates to sovereign states. Sovereignty needs to be recognized, and there's equality between and among states, and non-intervention in internal affairs. But on the other hand, those hegemons, those great powers, often they want to establish a hierarchical economic statecraft order so that they can better have influence upon other countries. But please don't forget, we are now in a modern Westphalia world, right? So we can no longer establish a hierarchical international order. We have to make sure that every country, big and small, rich or poor, strong, weak, needs to be treated equally. So in other words, it is extremely difficult, and for me, hard to imagine that China-centered tributary system would be restored. Because why? The tributary system practiced by China Empire for more than 2,000 years basically established a hierarchical center with China, a hierarchical order with China at the center. But this idea is difficult to sell, and China refused to sell that idea in today's China's economic statecraft. Okay, so any hegemons or any empire imaginations become more and more difficult to be accepted by the peoples, right?
The United States is doing it. Sorry.
Yeah.
But the United States is doing it. It is establishing a hierarchical structure, even though China may refuse to.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sayum. Thank you, Professor, for your astonishing presentation of your book. I've read your book and it's really interesting. And now I have a question. I just heard about like hierarchical order, independence, and you've said that now it's new economic statecraft. So how would you comment? Like, are there any change to be or they are already changing something in Eurasia's economic statecraft? Is it changing or it's just stable as it is like within these years? Thank you.
Yeah, Nadim just mentioned that the United States hegemony is establishing a hierarchical order. I cannot fully agree with that. I think that at least on surface, I mean, the United States, they are not basically building a hierarchical order, at least on surface. But you may argue that some American multinational corporations or some American administration is trying to build America-centered international order, right? With the United States having the major or the decisive role, but basically every great power is trying to build an international order or world order which is favorable to their national interest. China is doing that, Russia is doing that, even the European Union is trying to have all the other many other countries, for example, in Central Asia, to adopt EU standards. But can you argue that the EU is trying to build a hierarchical order? Because, okay, you can argue the EU practice European global gateway, trying to convince Central Asia countries to adopt EU standards. So do you agree that the EU is practicing a new form of economic imperialism? I mean, of course you can argue that, but sometimes it's difficult to convince, right? So basically, I would argue maybe all the major economies is trying to build their own world order, economic order, which would be favorable to their own interests. Everybody's doing that.
The American ambassador to China just said yesterday, we cannot live in a world dominated by Chinese. Now, what is that? Is that not placing America above China and therefore a hierarchical arrangement? Why would you deny that? William Burns.
I mean, basically, we all know that the United States and China now having strategic competition. And both the United States and China have their own ideas of their own versions of international orders. So for China, for 2,000 years, China practiced the tributary system, which today is impossible to sell. So, but still, China sees that the US-led international order has a lot of holes, a lot of problems. So China wants to complement that. So BRI is actually one tool of promoting, according to China's standards, a more fair international order with more and more Confucius elements, more and more Chinese elements. And basically, for the Biden administration, it wants to maintain the US-led international order, which is built upon liberal democracy. So basically, I see China and the United States are competing against each other on international orders. But who stands above whom? Who will finally win the long marathon of international order? Largely remain an issue of economic statecraft, isn't it? So the one who practices economic statecraft in a more efficient and a more sustainable way could finally have their version of international order established. So I do believe between China and the United States, that is a long marathon. So again, I think that's, I mean, basically what I said is a little bit of a mercantilist because that's really a zero-sum game.
And a lot of
realism. But you are as an economist, of course, offensive regionalism. Yeah, that's, I mean realism, yeah. But also I have my economist mindset, right? I believe in win-win. I participated in China's accession to the WTO negotiations. So I do believe that at the end of the day, if you only see the world black or white, you only see the world as zero-sum game, you cannot really go far. So I think I prefer a mixture of moderate, a defensive realism and economic liberalism. Yeah, and back to your question. Yeah, I think that there were a lot of influence, sometimes repetitive influence imposed by great powers in Central Asia, including here in Kazakhstan. And I think that those great powers are wrong. They think that they can manipulate to some extent. Sometimes they deny. I think that they made a big mistake. I believe in the agency of countries of Central Asia. So I believe in that Kazakhstan and other Central Asian countries, they can use their own economic statecraft, make use of their geographies and also cultivate their own human talents. So that's why I believe KMAP plays a role. The higher education institutions in Central Asia plays a role. And I believe that the interconnection, connectivity plays a role. And you can make best use of the geo-economic competition between among those great powers to benefit your own country, like Kazakhstan's multi-vector diplomacy is indeed very important. But also, I would like to argue sovereignty, political independence would be of utmost importance for Central Asia countries. Because if you lose that, you lose everything. So in that sense, you need to embrace an idea of a European continental politics, which is balance of power. Again, that's the idea of realism, balance of power. Okay, thank you.
Just extension of the student's question. So you referred mostly to the states' actions, right? Indicate Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. I wonder whether you can extend it towards the region, Central Asian regions' activeness or the agency. I wonder how far we are as a region, Central Asia, showing our actors in international politics.
Absolutely. I think that Central Asia is destined to be a very important player of regionalism. And I'm quite surprised to see that so far there isn't an institutional setup focused on in Central Asia. I heard of there is some program called CARIC, right? Central Asia Economic Cooperation Program, which is anchored in ADB. But I have not heard that there is a long-standing Central Asia regional organization. I think that must be something to do with the great powers' influence. Often regionalism is believed needs to be protected by a hegemon. So this is what the so-called hegemonic stability theory is about. So in other words, to foster regionalism, foster regionalism, foster regionalization, you need to have a protector, a regional hegemon or a global hegemon. I think that idea is problematic. For example, in the Caribbean region, in the Eastern Caribbean region, there's CARICOM, Caribbean Community. There are other types of regional organizations like Association of Caribbean States. So if in the Caribbean region, those states can form and establish their own regional organization, why can't Central Asia states to establish a long-term organization? And I believe that Central Asia regional diplomacy, regionalization would be of extreme importance for economic statecraft, for economic diplomacy, for economic well-being, welfare of the Central Asia region. And I do believe that railways, roads, ports, middle corridor are very important components of this Central Asia regionalization. That's why I believe that your paper is very important, because I see your paper is one of the first pioneering papers talking about Central Asia regionalization. And of course, your papers have talked about relationship with BRI. But I think now it's a once in a century opportunity here that we can practice new regionalism in Central Asia, in the vertex of China, Russia, European Union, United States. So let all the big guys play here, but you have your own actorness. You make use of those great guys, big guys, but to avoid those big elephants to step into your porcelain shop. So that requires skills, art, strategies, and process of economic statecraft. Thank you.
I'm asking too many questions. Just last one. So ARSA a very good kind of regional framework, right? I wonder whether it also can be extendable towards Eurasia.
I think that it is possible. So when we negotiate, all the RCEP countries negotiated this agreement, first we included India, but at the last minute, India quitted. So potentially, the RCEP could be extended to India and to other Eurasian countries. For example, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, especially China as one of the members, is promoting SCO, free trade agreement. And also China proposed to sign a free trade agreement with Eurasia Economic Union. So that's why I say China, to a large extent, is still practicing economic liberalism. And I don't know how China can really combine Marxism and economic liberalism. But still, very strangely, on trade front, China is so proactive. So basically, if someone proposed an idea of signing a Eurasia free trade agreement, I think China would be among the first to endorse that idea. So that is why China is very much committed to joining the CPTPP, and China is still very much committed to signing SCO free trade agreement. That's going to include India, Pakistan, and Central Asian countries, and also Russia, and also with a free trade agreement with the Eurasia Economic Union. So largely in the heartland, we could have a free trade agreement. So the heartland would practice open regionalism, economic liberalism, instead of those zero-sum game. So I think for a Eurasia economic agreement, for a Eurasia free trade agreement, I believe personally it is on the agenda of Chinese policy makers. The reason is very simple, because China economically is extremely competitive, especially when it comes to manufactured goods. And increasingly, China is more and more competitive in e-commerce, digital economy, on environmental goods and services, and all other types of professional services. So that is why the free trade agreement, I think that at some point, about 10 years ago, China even wanted to sign a free trade agreement with the United States. But unfortunately, it was declined. And when I served as the trade attaché of the Chinese mission to the European Union, China is promoting free trade agreements with the European Union. But the European Union said, because of China's big size, even though China fits all the criteria of a free trade agreement partner for the EU needs to have a second thoughts to have a China-EU free trade agreement. So thank you for your question. But I think the puzzle lies in whether China can really manage to combine its genes of Marxism and a new type of gene, which is important, which is liberalism. Combine the two genes together. But in most cases, these two genes are not compatible. Okay, thank you so much for participation, and I think today event, not only an event of my book launch, but also event of my class, China's Domestic Politics and Foreign Policy. And also I very much appreciate the online participation. And for the China Central Asia Studies Center, CCASC, we would have more events this year. So we will keep you updated, and please visit our website, CAS as China Central Asia Studies Center, and we would update you with more events. So this year for our center, we were very much focused on green economy, digital transformation, connectivity, and other relevant subjects. And we also very much focused on the power politics between and among great powers, including Russia, including European Union, China, United States, India. Go ahead.
Can you hear?
Yes, we.
So you mentioned about the digital transformation, right? So what exact the type or module for the digital transformation as you think? What do you think of it?
I think that means we would very much interested in researching on Central Asia's digital infrastructure, e-commerce, and take Kazakhstan as an example. Kazakhstan is going through the digital transformation. That means Kazakhstan will build more digital infrastructure, conducting digital trade along the middle corridor, and doing more e-commerce, transit trade, so linking up Southeast Asia, China, all the way to European Union. So when we say digital transformation, that means something relates to digital technology. But this kind of transformation will be across the board, across all types of trade, services, and economic performance. So we are basically on the eve of the fourth industrial revolution. So this kind of digital or AI would be one of the major research pillars for our center. And I see more and more countries now coming up with initiatives for intergovernmental collaboration on digital trade and green economy. So I think those are the prototypes of future trade, investment, or economic partnership agreements. So Central Asia would be the hotbed of more and more trade agreements, more and more regionalization efforts focused on sectors like digital trade, like green economy, environmental services, and trade, and etc. So I think that this is once in a century opportunity for countries to refuse confrontational approach like war, like a geopolitical confrontation, but are more and more focused on economic collaboration. So I believe that we all have the conscience and the talents of finding sustainable way of maximal connectivity instead of resorting to war means. So I believe that we are much cleverer and much smarter than 100 years ago, especially incorporating all the historical lessons, especially in the context of the major great powers all possessing nuclear weapons. So any war between China and the United States, any war among Russia, China, United States, India, Pakistan, or any nuclear weapon possessors would be hardly imaginable. And that should be completely refused and rejected. That's the mission of all people, all intellectuals should have. With that, I conclude today's book launch event. Thank you very much and see you next time.